Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over chapters 13 and 14 of J.D. Salinger's classic, The Catcher in the Rye. Let's see just what happens next, shall we? All right, let's dive in to chapter 13. Chapter 13 starts with Holden walking the 41 blocks back to his hotel. He said the reason he didn't catch a cab was because he felt like after 2 cab rides already, he just wanted to walk. He goes on to say that you wouldn't have even known it had snowed due to the sidewalks not having any on them. However, it was very cold, so he took out his red hunting hat and put it on his ears. He didn't care how he looked because at least his head was warm. He wishes that he had his gloves, but he lost them back at Pensy and they were no longer on him. By mentioning the gloves, Holden then goes on to say that he's a pretty yellow guy, meaning that if he had found out who stole his gloves, he would have gone down to the room of the crook, confronted him, but would not have hit him in the face or anything. Instead, he would have looked around the room till he found his gloves, pulled them out, and confronted the guy even further. Holden continues with this made-up situation, saying that instead of hitting the guy in the face, he would essentially just make the guy more and more upset until he burst out. Holden then says that the reason he doesn't like to physically get into altercations is because he doesn't like looking the other guy in the face to do it. As you go through this whole ordeal in his head, he then says that he would stop off at another bar and have a few drinks. Holden tells the reader that he can handle his alcohol pretty well, and he mentions a time when he was at Wooten's school with another boy and how they bought a pint of scotch and drank it in the chapel one Saturday night. He says his friend got stinking drunk. However, Holden was able to keep his cool. He does tell the reader that he throws up before going to bed that night, but it's primarily because he did it to himself and that he wanted to throw up. That way he would feel better. Holden says before he gets to the hotel, he stops outside of a bar, and as he's looking in, 2 men are coming out. He says one man is a Cuban-looking man and keeps breathing directly in Holden's face, which smells very much of alcohol, and it smells very bad. He decides that he's not going to go into that bar and instead just continues to the hotel. He tells the reader that when he gets back to the hotel, the entire lobby is empty and smelled like 50 million dead cigarettes. He says he wasn't sleepy or anything, but he was feeling sort of lousy and depressed. He tells the reader that he then gets himself into a big mess. He goes on to explain that as he's getting inside the elevator boy asks if he's interested in having a good time. He also mentions this elevator boy is a new elevator boy that has switched out with the old one. Through a small conversation with the bellboy, Holden agrees to meet with the prostitute and have some company for the night. The elevator boy tells him it's $5 a throw or 15 until noon. As Holden is exiting the elevator, he tells the elevator boy his room number and the door closes and he's off to his room. Once he's back in his room, he then wets his hair and starts to get dressed and puts on a clean shirt. While he's doing this, he then gives the reader a little bit of insight about all the times that he's gotten very close to having sex. He tells the reader that he's still a virgin even though there were many times he could have had sex due to the opportunity. However, he tells the reader that every time he was close to having sex, something inevitably went wrong. Whether it was the backseat of someone's car and he was on a double date with someone, the couple in front would always want to know what's going on and would turn around at the most inopportune times. Or he would be at a girl's house and they'd be kissing and making out, and then they would go further, but he was always afraid the parents would come in or that someone would walk in at the wrong time. He says that one time as he was fooling around with a girl, it took him almost an hour to get her bra off, and by the time he finally did do this, she was just fed up and didn't want anything else. He tells the reader that though he really doesn't want the prostitute, and that he kind of wishes that she wasn't going to come tonight, he is also partially glad because now he can finally get his first time out of the way and hopefully get some experience under his belt before he gets married. Also that he wants to do it with someone before a girl he really likes. He then also mentions that whenever he was a little bit younger, he read a book about an English guy and how he was very James Bond-esque, and how he went through a lot of women and how he always compared his relationships to women with being good at playing the violin. And Holden really likes this metaphor. He kind of wants to do the same thing. As all of this is going on through his head, there's a knock at the door and he rushes over to open it. As he's on his way to open the door, he trips over his suitcase and gets a little bit embarrassed, but then opens the door. Standing in front of him was a prostitute, and through a small conversation he lets her in. When he closes the door, she immediately goes and sits in the chair next to the desk, and Holden can see she's very nervous. He offers her a cigarette, but she doesn't accept it because she tells him that she doesn't smoke. She asked what his name is and how old he was, and Holden responds that his name is Jim Steele and he's 22 years old. When he tells her this, she says, "Like fun you are," which kind of catches him off guard because as he's looking at her, he's realizing she can't be much older than he is, because an older grown woman would have said like, hell you are, or something of that nature. But he asks her, how old are you? And she said that I'm plenty old enough. After this, she gets up and pulls her dress over her head and puts it down on the floor. Holden mentions how this was supposed to be a pretty sexy thing, but instead it just seemed kind of depressing. She asks if he had a watch, and he says he doesn't. He asks again what her name is, and she tells him that it's Sunny. Sunny is trying to rush this through and trying to get this over with, but Holden is asking her to slow down and just talk for a moment. She asks him what he's doing, and he says nothing, and before jumping into it, he'd rather have a conversation and just talk for a little bit. At the sound of this, she gets irritated. She goes back to the chair and sits down in it. All the while, she's still jiggling her leg nervously. He asks her if she would like a cigarette, but she again insists that she doesn't smoke. He asks her where she's from, and he says, you're obviously not from New York, to which she said no, she's from Hollywood. After this, she asks if he has a hanger because she wants to hang up the dress and make sure it doesn't get wrinkly. Holden is all too happy to get her a hanger, and he hangs up the dress for her. As they're having a small conversation, she begins to walk around the room looking at things and picking things up and putting them back down. As he's getting to know her a little bit, he decides he really doesn't want to have sex with her. In fact, now he's feeling more depressed than sexy. Sunny then goes over to him and sits on his lap and asks what the matter was. Holden says that he had an operation recently, and through the conversation she asks where, and he says his clavichord. And she asks, oh, where is that? And he states, oh, it's far down in the spinal canal. They then again try to make small talk, but it's really not going anywhere. Then, after Sunny tried to have sex with him again, Holden gets up and tells her to get off of him. And he gets up and goes over to his wallet, and he goes to get the money, and says that he's going to pay her regardless. He pulls out a $5 bill and hands it to her. And when he does, she said, it's 15, not 5. Holden tells her, no, it's $5 a throw, 15 until noon. That's what the elevator boy said. He tells her he's not going to pay her more than $5. After this, she asks if he would get her dress, and she does this very coldly and bitterly. Holden is all too happy, and so he does so. And as he gives her the clothes, she puts it on. And then as she's leaving, she tells him, so long, crumb bum. Holden says, so long, and he didn't thank her or anything. He was just glad she left. This is where chapter 13 ends. Now, let's dive into chapter 14. Chapter 14 starts out after Sunny has left. Holden mentions that it was becoming daylight outside, and he felt miserable and depressed. He said that when he does this, he imagines he's talking to his brother Allie. He then tells the reader the small little memory that he had of his brother back in Maine during the summertime. He tells the reader that while they were vacationing in Maine, he would meet his friend Bobby Fallon outside of his house, and they would pack lunches, bring their BB guns, and go out for the day. He said that he remembered specifically one time when his brother had asked if he could join them, and he said no. Now that Allie was dead, Holden wishes that he could have taken him with him. He tells the reader that in moments like these, when he's really depressed, he pretends he's talking to Allie, and tells him to go home, get his BB gun, materials, and come back and meet them. After this memory, he begins to get undressed and get to bed. He said he felt like praying, but he just wasn't in the mood. He tells the reader that he's sort of an atheist. He said that he likes Jesus and all, but he really could care less for the disciples or anyone else in the Bible. He tells the reader that, to tell you the truth, the disciples kind of annoyed him. He said they kept letting him down whenever he was trying to do something. He then goes on to mention that there was a boy at Wooten School named Arthur Childs who had always disagreed with him on many things about the Bible. Holden says this was because Childs was a Quaker, and he read the Bible almost every day. Holden said he was nice enough though, but they could never really see eye to eye on anything when it concerned religion. He also goes on to say that he asked Childs one day if he thinks that Judas is in hell, and Childs says, oh yeah, Judas is in hell, but Holden says, I don't believe Judas is in hell. And this is one of the examples where they couldn't see eye to eye. He also says his parents are of different religions, but all the children in his family were atheists. He also goes on to say how one thing he also can't stand is how a lot of ministers speak in a holier-than-thou voice when giving sermons. Holden says this really annoys him because they just need to use their natural voices. After this, he keeps trying to fall asleep, but he remembers what Sunny calls him before she left. He says he smokes another cigarette, but it tastes pretty lousy, and he thinks he's smoked at least 2 packs since he left Pensy. He then tells the reader that as he's laying there smoking, he hears a knock on the door. He knows it's his door, but he wishes it wasn't. And he also says he pretty much knows who it is on the other side. He says that as he gets up, he asks who's there, but the knocking just continues. He says he gets up, puts on his pajamas, goes to open the door. He said he didn't even turn the light on because it was already getting daylight inside the room. He said that they're standing in the doorway, and the people who were standing there was Sunny and Maurice. The Maurice being the elevator boy. Holden says They next have a conversation where Maurice tells Holden that he still owes Sonny $5. They get into an argument where Holden says, I don't owe him any more money, and that Maurice had told him it was $5 a throw and 15 until noon. Holden says that if Maurice had said 10 from the beginning, he would not have minded paying, but that's not the price they agreed upon. During this argument, Maurice and Sonny enter the room, and Maurice gets very close to Holden, which really scares him. As they continue arguing, Maurice becomes intimidating when asking for more money. Holden tries to hold him off, but Maurice is unbuttoning his shirt, looking like he's ready to attack. As Maurice has Holden cornered, Sonny goes over to the dresser and finds Holden's wallet. Sonny tells Holden they're only going to take the $5 they're owed, and no more because they're not crooks. When she has the $5, she starts to head out and tells Maurice that they need to leave Holden alone. During this, Holden can't hold back anymore and tells Maurice that he is a goddamn dirty moron. At the sound of this, Maurice looks at Holden and asks, "What was that?" Holden goes on and says that he was a goddamn dirty moron, and that pretty soon, about 2 years, he'll be one of those scraggly guys that comes up to you on the street corner asking for a dime for coffee. You'll have snot all over your dirty, filthy overcoat, but before Holden can finish, Maurice knocks him in the stomach with a fatal blow. Holden falls to the floor like he did with Stradlater earlier that evening, and he watches Sonny and Maurice make their way out of the room. When they left, and they shut the door, Holden stays on the ground for a little bit longer. After a while, he gets up and goes to the bath and holds his stomach. He then tells the reader his fantasy he has for getting revenge, and that would be that he would pretend that Maurice had shot him, and that he would go to the bathroom and get a glass of bourbon or whiskey to settle his nerves, and then he'd get into action. He would get dressed, put an automatic pistol in his pocket, and then walk down the stairs holding his stomach while bleeding, and he would make sure to walk down the stairs until he got to the bottom. Then, when Maurice was exiting the elevator, he would pull out the automatic and put 6 rounds of shots inside of Maurice's stomach. Then, once Maurice was dead, he would then wipe off the gun for fingerprints and toss it down the elevator shaft. Then, he says that he would crawl back up to his room where he would call Jane and have her come over and bandage him up. He imagines her holding a cigarette for him while he was bleeding. He tells the reader that movies sure can ruin you. However, what he actually did was stay in the bathroom for about an hour, taking a bath, and then getting into bed. He tells the reader that it took him a little while to fall asleep because he wasn't tired, but finally he does. Right before he falls asleep, he felt like he should commit suicide, but he says he doesn't because if he did commit suicide, he would want someone to put a blanket over him immediately after it was done. That way, all the rubberneckers on the street wouldn't see him in all of the gore. This is where chapter 14 ends. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, stay lit.